Hello students, as you can tell, I'm recording this on Ash Wednesday 2015. I want to go a little bit more in depth on the last interpretive tool that I presented to you in the last module. We were talking about these recurring patterns in Scripture, and I want to focus on one particular motif, a literary pattern that occurs at least 3 times in the Old Testament, and actually has its precedent in an Ugaritic tale. Notice I keep referring to this literature outside of the Bible, especially from the corpus of literature we have from Ugarit. This city being, we think, Canaanite. I'm going to call them Canaanites. They have a lot in common with the culture of the Hebrews, and even though most of their literature is written long before Israel became a nation, it still has, it provides us with a good background, a cultural background for understanding the stories that we find in the Bible. And the stories that we're going to look at in this module all involve women who use food to destroy the enemies of their people. And the first time we ever hear this sort of literary pattern, first time we encounter it, is actually in a tale from Ugarit called the Tale of Akat. Akat is this young man. He is the son of Danilu. This would be the same name as Daniel that we know in the Hebrew Bible. Danilu is a beloved of the gods. He is very pious. He routinely offers sacrifices and prayer, and he does what is right. He is a just and righteous man. For a long time, Danilu and his wife are barren. They have no children. Again, this sounds familiar, doesn't it? We have similar motifs in the Old Testament. Righteous people who cannot have children. So after a long period of prayer and offering sacrifices, eventually Ilu, the father of all the gods, grants Danilu his request and gives him a son named Akat. And then later, evidently, it doesn't tell us this explicitly, evidently they have other children. In particular, they have a daughter whose name is Pugat, or Parit, or we're not exactly sure how to pronounce her name because there are no vowels in Ugaritic, and so all we have are consonants. So her name is P, G-H, Ryan, it's a R sound. You gotta kind of swallow in the back of your throat, and then T. So Puat or Parit, something like this. She is Akat's little sister. Anyway, as Akat is growing up, his family, being beloved by the gods, they get special treatment. And when he is a young man on his birthday, the craftsman of the gods, Kothar V'Chasis, he's the builder, the tool maker. He's kind of the Hephaestus of the Canaanites. Kothar V'Chasis, he crafts a bow for Akat. Probably this fabulous bow that is given to Akat, it probably in some way corresponds to the development of the new technology involved in creating compound bows. Before this they had simple bows, but at some certain time they developed the technique of this much more strong bow that is capable of shooting much farther and with much greater force. And it seems that this is the kind of bow that Kothar V'Chasis presents Akat with. It may be that he actually invents it. In any case, Akat has this new fancy bow, and he's going everywhere with it and kind of showing off with it and such. And he catches the eye, his bow catches the eye, of the warrior goddess Anat. This is Baal's little sister. And Anat is not someone that you want to tangle with. She is pretty, she's dangerous. So Anat, she comes down and she pleads with Akat to give her his bow, and he refuses. She makes ludicrous offers to him. She tells him that she will marry him, that he will become one of the gods if he will just give her his bow. And Akat refuses. Finally, this continues for so long that Akat finally begins to taunt her and tells her to go away, saying that bows and arrows are not fit for women to have. These are men's objects. Well, Anat is not pleased to hear this in the least, and she immediately storms off and plots Akat's demise. She hires an assassin named Yotpan, and Yotpan, he's a mortal man. He's a great warrior. She makes a plan that when Akat is eating, she will send Yotpan upon him like a hawk in the midst of this banquet. So here we have the first iteration of this motif. We have someone eating at table, and this lovely woman uses the opportunity of the distraction of food to do in the person that she wants to kill. And this is indeed what happens. She flies up into the air with Yotpan tucked into her belt, and at the right moment she pulls him out of her belt and sends him down upon Akat like a hawk. And Yotpan takes away Akat's life. Anat gets his bow, and Danilu and his family, including the lovely Parit, they are left to mourn Akat. Years pass. Finally, as Parit grows up and becomes a beautiful young lady, she has thoughts of revenge, and she wants to kill Yotpan for killing her brother. And so she devises a plan. It's interesting. She makes herself look. First of all, she puts on warrior's apparel. She puts on a suit of mail. She tucks a dagger into her belt, and in many ways, she makes herself look like Anat. The same language. If you study Canaanite literature, you see these parallels between the language used to describe Parit's preparations for battle and the language used regarding Anat, and that's very interesting. So Anat, who killed Parit's brother, in some ways serves as a model for Parit for how she's going to get revenge. So Parit, she puts on this warrior's clothing, and she makes sure she has a knife ready, and then she covers this suit of mail with a beautiful dress, and then she proceeds to put makeup on and doll herself up. I'm not kidding. It tells explicitly what kinds of makeup she puts on. I remember it says that she puts on some eyeshadow. It's called chachol in Hebrew, and there's a cognate word in the Ugaritic, and also says that she puts on rouge on her cheeks. In any case, she makes herself quite lovely, quite attractive. And then she goes into the camp of Yotpan, and his men bring her to Yotpan, and they say to Yotpan, "Here is the woman whom we have hired." It sounds as though she has hired herself out as a prostitute. There is one other interpretation. Some people think that they actually confuse her for Anat, and that the way it should be read is that here is the woman who hired us. I think it's probably more accurate to interpret it as though they have hired her. So Parit has dressed herself as a prostitute and is hiring herself out to Yotpan. And then it proceeds to tell about how Yotpan chases everyone out of the tent, and Pagit proceeds to dine with him and to feed him, and especially to give him lots of wine to drink. And the text is rather funny. Yotpan, you can hear his language getting slurred, and he's getting drunk and more boastful, and he starts to get 10 foot tall and bulletproof. Begins to say things like, "Which one of the gods wants to take me on? I'll take any one of them. I'm taking all challengers, including the gods. If Baal wants to get in a fight, I'll let him have it." So here's this mortal man beginning to say all these boastful things, saying he could take on a god. So she just keeps pouring one glass of wine after another, and his boasts become more obnoxious and louder, and then the tablet breaks off. So we're not really sure how the story ends, but I think it's a pretty good guess that Yotpan gets killed. And he probably drinks himself to oblivion, and then Parit, I would assume, kills him. I think that's probably the way it is headed. And so then you have this irony that Yotpan, who is challenging the gods to a fight, winds up being slain by this young maiden. And that's the point of the story. So this is our first instance of what will become a very popular literary motif in the Hebrew Bible. So our first instance, actually, we have kind of two instances. First, Anat kills Akat, and then Parit kills Yotpan, and both of them use food. The situation between Parit and Yotpan is more precisely related to the other stories that we are going to look at. The first of the Old Testament stories that I want to look at is the book of Esther. And the reason I've chosen this one first is because it's probably the last of these stories to be written, or at least to take on. It's a little bit more developed in Esther than it is in the other two accounts that we'll look at. So Esther is a beautiful book, and if you've never read Esther, I think this would make a great choice for your devotional reading that you were assigned to do, 15 minutes of scripture reading. I think Esther would be a great choice for that, because it is really a novel, and it's a fun story to read. There's lots of humor in Esther. And we'll look a little of this. I'm not going to do Esther any justice in this module because there's simply too much to talk about, and I want to focus on some particular things. The whole book of Esther is really written to explain why there is a festival called Purim. Purim means lots in the language of Persian. This whole book is set in Persia. It is written in Hebrew, but it is set in Persia, and there are a lot of Persian words in it, and certainly a lot of Persian names, but also some Persian words that show up in the text as well. And one of these is Purim, which becomes this festival. It's around the time of Mardi Gras, and there are a lot of parallels between Mardi Gras and Purim. This is a festival which the Talmud says you are to drink so much on Purim that you cannot tell the name Haman from the name Mordecai. And this is the name of the principal villain and one of the heroes of the story. Mordecai is the uncle of Esther. And so it is a mitzvah, a commandment, to drink enough on Purim that you can't tell one from the other. So this becomes a wild and raucous party on Purim. It's a lot of fun. They dress up in costumes. It used to be they would dress up in costumes pertaining to the story. Everyone would dress up as Haman or Mordecai or Esther, or one of the, maybe the King Artaxerxes, but today they'll dress up as Spider-Man or one of, some Halloween monster. It's funny, this is the one time a year, they don't have Halloween in Israel, but they have Halloween costumes in February or March for Purim. That's so interesting. In any case, this whole book is about how this festival, this banqueting festival, started. So it has banqueting kind of as its whole purpose. And the whole book, because it is a book about banqueting, it has the word for banquet more than any other book in the Bible. The Hebrew word for banquet is mishteh, and mishteh is literally drinking. That's what it means. It's a drinking party. And this word shows up in Esther more than 20 times. And Esther's not a very long book, so for this little bitty book to use the word mishteh more than any other book of the Bible is kind of astounding. And it shows that whoever wrote this book was thinking about banqueting a whole lot. And it makes sense when you think about what Purim is. Purim is a banqueting holiday. You're supposed to eat together with your friends, drink together, and you're supposed to send baskets to friends, especially to the poor, so that they can also eat and drink. It's a fun time of year. The book of Esther is about this young lady. Her name is Hadassah, and my oldest daughter is named after Esther. Her name is Hadassah because my wife loved this story. Before she even knew me, my wife knew she was going to have a daughter named Hadassah. And Hadassah's parents were not told what happened to them, but evidently they have passed away, and so she is raised by her uncle Mordecai. Mordecai, he's a very proud Jewish man, but he has a high position in the court of Artaxerxes. He is in the court of the Persians, has some political standing. He also is directly opposed to another man in the court named Haman. And Haman seems to have a lot of favor with the king. Setting all this up, the first part of the book of Esther is all about how Esther winds up being married to the king. The king's wife, Vashti, she makes the king mad because she won't come out and display her beauty to his nobles after he has become king. She will not. She will not come out to show herself off to all of the king's friends, and so he divorces her. And then he needs another wife, another queen. And so they have this beauty pageant. King Artaxerxes tries them all out, and eventually Mordecai, he puts his niece into the running to be queen, and so Esther then becomes the queen of Persia when Artaxerxes falls in love with her. Now, shortly after all of this happens, Haman, he becomes really upset with Mordecai because Mordecai will not pay him obeisance. Mordecai says, you don't deserve any respect from me, and so he will not bow down to Haman. Some interpreters look at this as though Haman was expecting him to do him worship, as though he were God. The text does not say that. I think it's more just a matter of he is a proud man, and he doesn't feel that he needs to lower himself for the likes of a guy like Haman. And Haman, being deeply offended, he's not used to people not giving him this kind of honor and respect. Haman decides he's going to kill Mordecai. Not only will he kill Mordecai, he will destroy the whole nation of the Jews. He will destroy all of Mordecai's people. Now, Esther, she is in the court of the king. She's a Jewess, but when she entered the Persian court, she changed her name from Hadassah, her Jewish name, her Hebrew name, to Esther, a Persian name. And you get the impression, it's funny, one of the things about the book of Esther is Artaxerxes, the king, is really a dolt. He doesn't know what's going on. He's just really very stupid. And one of the ways that you see he's stupid is he doesn't even know what ethnicity his wife is. He has no idea that she's Jewish. And so when Haman comes to King Artaxerxes with this proposal to put into law this edict that will eradicate all of the Jews in the Persian Empire, Artaxerxes signs it. He lets Haman talk him into this. He has no idea that he's even married to a Jewess. So, he's stupid. And so then Mordecai comes to Esther, and he begs her to intervene, to do something to save her people. And Esther is very frightened. She does not want to do this. And the reason is, she says, I have not seen the king for days, for weeks. And you don't just go and call upon King Artaxerxes. You have to be summoned. And she doesn't know when he's going to summon her. And she feels very intimidated by him. She doesn't feel that she can just go into his throne room, because to do so is almost certain death. The king does not welcome people to come into his throne room uninvited, even his own wife. If she should come in there, he's liable to have her executed. Evidently has a reputation for doing this sort of thing. And the way it works is, if someone comes into the throne room of the king and approaches him, and if you find favor in his sight, he appoints his royal scepter to you, and you are allowed to speak to him. Otherwise, his guards are going to take you out and cut off your head or something like this. So, no wonder Esther is very frightened. But Mordecai persists and says, do not think that you're going to escape and all of us die. That if you do not do anything to help your people, the same fate that we will meet will find you out also. And then he says, about the only statement in the whole book that has any kind of hint of religion in it. It's a very secular book, actually. But he says to her, who knows that you have not been appointed to this position for such a time as this. So you have this idea of providence going on, that God put you where he did so you could help your people. Now, I mentioned in the intensive weekend that we have two versions of this story. So the Hebrew version, the name of God and all of this religious stuff doesn't show up at all. And that little verse there is as close as you get. In the Greek version, it is heavily embellished with lots and lots of prayers, and God's name shows all over the place. They kind of overcompensate for its secular nature by making it a hyper-religious novel. But in any case, I'm glad we have both versions. Both of them are beautiful works of literature. They're really almost two separate books, though. So Esther finally, she is convinced that she does have to do this, and she then tells Mordecai to fast and to pray. Here again is about all we hear about God intervening, that we have this reference to prayer and to fasting. She also prays and fasts, and she prepares to approach the king. When she does so, here is another one of those places where the Greek is quite a bit different from the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it's very straightforward. She goes in there, and Artaxerxes points his scepter to her. She kisses it, and so she is received and able to make her request of the king. In the Greek, they make it very melodramatic. Esther, she is quailing with fear, and she has to really build herself up. And when she finally decides to go into King Artaxerxes' throne room, she actually faints, and Artaxerxes is actually moved by her emotional state, and gets up out of his throne, which is astounding. That never happened in the Persian Empire. He gets out of his throne, comes to her side, and shows mercy and compassion on her. And then he holds out his throne to her, his scepter to her. And I think all of this in the Greek text is an attempt to maybe explain why Artaxerxes was moved to receive Esther. Whereas the Hebrew doesn't explain it at all. It just has her go in there very confident, and this is, I think, kind of this unspoken world of providence that Esther is written in. So King Artaxerxes is moved to receive her and hear her request. He tells her to ask anything that she wants, even up to half of his kingdom. He's willing to give it to her. And Esther, if you, the reader, as you're reading this, you're expecting her to come right out and say, I want you to rescue my people, the Jews, and get rid of Haman. He's a weasel, and he needs to be killed. That's not what she does. Instead, she says, why don't you and your good old buddy Haman, why don't you come to a banquet that I'm preparing for you? I want to have a party, and so come to my apartment, you and your friend Haman, and I will prepare something really nice to eat, and there will be lots to drink, and we'll have a good old time. So Artaxerxes says, yeah, we'll be there. You name the time and the place, we're there. Haman is delighted. He cannot believe his good fortune to be invited. Of all of the council members of the king's parliament, he is the one that gets to have this private dinner with the king and his queen. So he cannot believe his good fortune. And so he shows up at the party, and King Artaxerxes again makes his request to Esther. Ask me whatever you want, I'll give it to you, up to half of my kingdom. And Esther says, all that I desire, O my king, is for you to come to another party. So again, we have this delayed gratification of seeing the good guys win and Haman hung from his own noose. We have to wait again. So, all of this tension builds up, and then we have, and so the storyteller is very artful. He's done a wonderful job of writing this and playing on our emotions and our interests in the story, our investedness in the story. And so Haman, he's even more delighted. He gets to go to another special banquet, and he goes home and he brags all about it. And I'm leaving out a lot of the best parts of the book here because I want to focus on this banquet. So they come together for the second banquet, and this is when Esther really decides to make her move. It's possible, I've thought a long time, why is it that Esther does this with the banquet? And I think there are a couple explanations. One explanation is maybe she's frightened, and so rather than come right out and ask for what she wants, she has to build up some courage, and she has to wait till she feels the moment is right. And so it takes a couple banquets to get there, get to feeling comfortable. That is a possibility. That certainly accords with the picture of Esther we get in the Greek version. Another idea is that she is kind of tightening the noose around Haman. She wants to really catch him and not give him any opportunity to escape, or any opportunity to try to weasel out of this or come up with an excuse, or she doesn't want it to backfire and have herself and all the Jews executed, because when it comes out that she is a Jewess. And so perhaps she's using her charms and her cooking skills to bring the king into her confidence, and also Haman as well, so that she can catch him and upstage him in a surprise attack. And that is, I think, a better possibility, and I would say from a historical point of view, that makes more sense to me. But the real reason Esther does this is because this is how women destroy the enemies of Israel in the Old Testament. That's the real reason. This is how this story goes. It's already happened. We're going to look at these two other stories following this, and you'll see what I mean. Those follow Pagit much more closely than the story of Esther. So, Esther, she has now wined and dined Artaxerxes and Haman, and the king once again makes this outlandish request: up to half of my kingdom. And remember, Persia is an empire at this point. It stretches from Egypt all the way to India. So this is a rather luxurious gift that he's willing to give to Esther. And Esther answers. This is, so in Esther chapter 7, verse 3, Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, it's put in the New American Bible. So Xerxes says, make any request, up to half of my kingdom. And she answers, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to be annihilated. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he, that would presume to do this? And at this point, I always imagine Haman, with a goblet of wine up to his lips, as he's, just listening. It doesn't really concern him, this conversation they're having. And does the classic double take, spewing wine all over the place, as he hears Esther says, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. So I think that's how I read the story, and I think that's how it's meant to be read, is with this kind of humorous skewering of Haman. So Haman is shown up. Ahasuerus, Xerxes, is so upset, so infuriated, he goes out to the veranda to cool off. And while he's out there, Haman, he cowers down before Esther, begging for his life, him clutching at her knees. That does Haman in. He says to one of the guards, what are we going to do with this guy? And one of the guards remembers that Haman had built a gallows to hang Mordecai from. And he says this to the king, and the king says, hang him on it. And that's exactly what happens. And so the Jews are rescued from their plight. They are not able to just revoke the edict that everyone is going to kill the Jews on this certain day in Adar, but the king is able, King Xerxes is able to issue another edict giving the Jews permission to actually defend themselves. And so it is the case that the Jews are told in advance of what is about to happen. They all assemble armies, and not only do they defend themselves, but they destroy all of the enemies of their people that are scattered throughout the Persian Empire, and a happy day was had by all. And so they celebrate Purim to this day, on the day that the edict was issued, when they cast lots to decide when they were going to destroy the Jews. This day that was supposed to be for sadness was turned to a day of joy because of God's intervention. And so they celebrate Purim to this day. And they eat and drink a lot. It's fun times. Now, we have a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas about Esther. Remember, we talked about types in the last module, and here St. Thomas Aquinas sees Esther as being a type. Listen to what he has to say. Through Queen Esther, that is, through the Blessed Virgin, the sentence of damnation passed against us was revoked, namely, through her intercession, through the extension of the king's golden scepter to Mary, and through her kiss on the top of that scepter, we are saved from hell and damnation. Queen Esther, that is the Blessed Virgin, pleased the eyes of the king in helping to redeem the human race, and she found favor in his presence, not only for herself, but for all mankind. And so, St. Thomas Aquinas sees Esther as a type of Mary, who is her antitype. And this is fascinating to me. This idea that the story we just read is actually, in some ways, a symbol, a picture of what is going to happen through the Blessed Virgin. And we'll see this in the other stories as well. So these patterns, when you see a pattern like this in Scripture, as we're going to see, a lot of times these patterns point to something bigger beyond them, just like this does. Okay? So St. Thomas Aquinas, he focuses on the episode there where Esther actually comes into the court of the king. And he is comparing this to Mary receiving the annunciation from the angel Gabriel that she will become the mother of the Messiah. And when Mary says, "May it be done unto me according to thy word," she, in effect, is kissing the scepter that is extended to her by the Lord. And so all of us who, like the Jewish people in Persia, stood condemned to death, now we are saved and rescued from death by the intervention of our Queen. It works rather nicely, doesn't it? St. Thomas Aquinas doesn't say anything about the banquet, but let's look at these other stories and see if Esther and these other heroines from the Old Testament might not be types of Mary in another sense as well. The next story that we're going to look at is much, much older. So Esther is from it's one of the last books of the Hebrew Bible to be written. Now we're going to look at a story that first appears in the book of Judges, in Judges chapter 5. In Judges chapter 5, we have the Song of Deborah. And this poem, the Song of Deborah, is quite possibly, it is among the oldest pieces of literature in the Bible. This little poem is. And it mentions Yael, or Jael, as we usually call her in English. And this story, you have these kind of oblique references to what's going on in the Song of Deborah. Much later, the narrative was written to accompany this. So chapter 4 is actually an older version of the story, a prose version that helps us understand what Deborah is singing about in chapter 5. But this Song of Deborah is very, very ancient. Among the most ancient pieces of literature we have in the Old Testament. If you look at Judges chapter 4, you find a lot of interesting things going on there. There's all sorts of things we could talk about here, but I want to focus on this motif of women using food to dispatch the enemies of their people. So at the very beginning, it tells us the situation. The Israelites, they do what's wrong in the sight of the Lord. Remember, you have this Deuteronomistic theology going on. Bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. Israel goes off, does bad things start to happen. And so they are subjected to King Jabin, the king of the Canaanites, who reigns from Hatzor. This is way up in northern Israel today. Way north of the Galilee. And he has a general in his army. His name is Sisera. And Sisera, we don't have a lot of description of him, but he's evidently a pretty bad man. So he's going around oppressing the Israelites for his king Jabin. They have a lot of chariots, iron chariots. So they have tanks. Israel If you remember, Israel is actually kind of, you're talking about a bunch of shepherds who've just moved into the country. So it'd be like hillbillies with clubs and swords and pitchforks. And here the established armies of the country are standing against them. You're talking about chariots, well-organized armies with lots and lots of firepower. And so the judge of Israel at this time is a lady named Deborah, and she assembles all of Israel to battle, and she puts them under the command of a general named Barak. Now Barak says, okay, I will go into battle, but I'm only going if you will go with me. And Deborah says, oh, very well, but since you're kind of being a weenie about all this, the Lord says he's going to give the victory into the hand of a woman and not to you. You won't get the glory of victory. It's going to go to a woman. So we have a little prophecy of what is about to happen at the end of the story. And so they go to battle. While they're all assembled, kind of gathering their armies, making their battle plans on Mount Tabor, this is actually the mountain where Jesus would be transfigured, a little more than 1,000 years later. Anyway, they're all gathered on Mount Tabor, and the Canaanites feel like they've got them trapped, and so they all assemble around the mountain, ready to catch Israel before they can get away. And the Lord intervenes. We're not exactly sure what happens. When you read about this in chapter 5, you get the idea that the cosmos itself is fighting for Israel. It talks about the stars fighting them, and this torrent comes up from this Wadi Kishon, and several of them drown in it. Anyway, it is a rout. Israel destroys the armies of Sisera, and they pursue them. And Sisera has to run away on foot because something happens to his chariot. So, while this is all going on, Sisera is running away. He's trying to get back to Hazor. And on the way, he passes by a tent. Now this tent, he recognized the tent. He knew who lived there because the person who owned this tent was a man named Hobab, who was in league with Jabin. He was a friend of the Canaanites. Now here's the thing about Hobab. His name means friend, and actually, his name's not Hobab. His father's name was Hobab. Let me see here. Heber. He comes to Heber is his name in Heber. And Heber means friend. His father's name, Hobab, also means friend. So that's where I got a little confused there. Hobab means beloved, friend. So both of these men, Heber and Hobab, they have these names that are resonant of the covenant relationship. If you are in a covenant with someone, you are a friend, you are a Heber. So that's the name of this guy. But look at verse 11. He had detached himself. That is, again, this is a word that would be used of someone who had broken away from a covenant. He had detached himself from Cain, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' father-in-law. So he's one of these Midianites who have come up into the land with the children of Israel. And all of the Midianites, they lived down south and around Judah. And that was where they established themselves. Moses had invited Hobab, his father-in-law, and all of the Midianites remember he had married a Midianite named Zipporah. He'd invited them all to come into the land. They're from a particular tribe of Midianites called the Kenites. And so he'd invited them to come into the promised land with them. And so they were treated as Israel. They are part of Israel. They are in a covenant relationship with Israel. enjoying the same benefits of the covenant, the land. But this guy, Heber, whose name means friend, covenant friend, he breaks himself off. You have this irony going on. Breaks himself off from the rest of the covenant community, and he pitched his tent, goes way up north, by the terebinth of Zaanannim, which is near Kedesh. Kedesh is way up in northern Israel. So this is where his tent is. So he has detached himself from this, from the children of Israel, and he has attached himself to Jabin and Sisera. Look at verse 17, Judges 4:17. So Sisera, he's running on foot. He's left his chariot, and he's running, trying to get away, running for his life. And he sees this tent that belongs to Heber. And look at verse 17. It says, there was peace between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber, the Canaanite. So this word, there is peace. That's the Hebrew word shalom. Again, this is covenant. There is a covenant relationship between Jabin and Heber, which this, if you are living in ancient Israel and you know the significance of covenants and you know what God has commanded to be done to the Canaanites and what the children of Israel and the Midianites are supposed to feel towards them, this should be very disturbing. Here is a man who was in covenant with Israel, and now he's gone off and joined the Canaanites. He's attached himself to the Canaanites. He's made himself a Canaanite for all intents and purposes. And so Sisera sees this tent as a safe place to be because he is within this covenant league with Heber and Jabin. So he turns aside there, and notice verse 18. As he turns aside, here is Yael waiting for him. She's already come out to meet him. Now, where is Heber? We don't know. Is he fighting with the armies of Jabin? We don't know. And so what transpires next? Again, if you know about the social mores of ancient Israel, this idea that a man would go into the tent of a woman, where a married woman, when her husband is nowhere around, there'd be red flags all over this. The rabbis say that this is part of the reason Sisera was killed by Yael, is because she knew that he was a womanizer, a philanderer, and that he had used and abused numerous women. And so, she's kind of a feminist. That's what the rabbis say. I don't know if you can get that much out of it, but it is a very suggestive circumstance here. So, Yael goes out to meet Sisera, and listen to what she says to him. "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside with me, do not be afraid." So he went into her tent, and she covered him with a rug. Again, that might sound kind of weird to us, but for the Bedouin peoples, rugs and blankets are all kind of the same thing. So she covers him with this blanket, this kind of lying on the floor, being used as a rug when no one is needing it for a comforter. And he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink. I'm thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and then covered him. Now, that might not sound like much, but the milk that she gives him is probably not fresh milk. Milk doesn't stay fresh very long in a goat skin in room temperature or warmer. And probably what this is what today is called in Israel labane. Just means white stuff. And labane is a delicious, soft cheese. It's kind of like yogurt, but it's saltier, and what they'll do is they'll smear a plate with labane, and they sprinkle it with a herb called zatar. It's actually hyssop. It's a kind of hyssop. And they pour olive oil on it. And I'm telling you, there are few things in life as good as a plate of labneh. One of my very favorite things in all the world is a good plate of labneh. And the Bedouins consider this to be a delicacy. This is not just a peanut butter sandwich that she gives him here. This is the height of hospitality. If you have an honored guest, you break out the labneh. And so this might not sound like much, but this is actually banquet fare for a Bedouin that she is presenting him with. And remember, he only asked for a cup of water. And so she gives him this labneh, and then he beckons her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. If anyone comes and asks, 'Is there someone here?' say no." Yael, king of Heber, got a tent peg and took a mallet in her hand. When Sisera was in a deep sleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the peg through his temple and down into the ground. And he died. There we get another one of these great understatements. So he died. You think? Anyway, so he died. Then when Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Yael went out to meet him and said to him, "Come, I will show you the man you are looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera dead, with the tent peg through his temple. And so Yael gains the victory over the enemy of God's people. Now, there are a lot of things about this story. I mean, a lot of Bible interpreters are bothered by this, that she deceives him in such a way, and she, the poor guy was expecting hospitality. Is this how you treat guests? And there was, what about this covenant relationship that she disregards? And we're not told exactly why she does it. Maybe she disagreed with what her husband had done. We don't know. What we do know is how Deborah felt about Yael. If you go to the next chapter, and this is actually the older version of the story, in Judges chapter 5, and look at verse 24. We have a verse here. "Most blessed of women is Yael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, blessed among tent-dwelling women." I want to read a little of this, because it's good to hear it in its original form. "He asked for water, she gave him milk. In a princely bowl she brought him curds." This is what I'm saying. This is more like a kind of cheese than milk. "With her hand she reached for the peg. With her right hand the workman's hammer. She hammered Sisera, crushed his head. She smashed, pierced his temple. At her feet," again you have this kind of, remember the euphemism for the sex organs. So at her feet he sank down. You have this kind of sexually charged atmosphere here with everything going on. "He sank down, fell, lay still. Down at her feet he sank and fell. Where he sank down, there he fell, slain." So there you have it. Yael does in Sisera. That first line, "Most blessed of women be Yael." Does this sound familiar? It ought to, because every time you pray the rosary, you echo these words, "Blessed among women." So let's look at another story where it'll pick up on this line, "Most blessed among women," and it adds a little bit more, and then we'll come back and look at Mary again. The third and last of the stories I want to look at is in the book of Judith. It's actually the entire book of Judith. Again, this is a lovely story. If you have never read Judith, this is one of my favorite books of the Old Testament. It is just a joy to read. Anyway, there is a whole lot of food in Judith. And the other thing about Judith, I believe there is a historical basis for the story, but it's not the history of the book. This is really an allegorical novel in many ways. It starts off telling us about King Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of the Assyrians. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was not the king of the Assyrians, he was the king of the Babylonians. Why is he called the king of the Assyrians? Because the author of this story has tried to wrap up all of the enemies of Israel into one big baddie. So we have King Nebuchadnezzar, who sends this general named Holofernes into Israel to attack the Jews. Judith's name, Judith, is just Hebrew for a Jewess. So she's kind of like an allegorical representation of the Jewish nation, I would say. She lives in a town that has never been discovered. We don't believe it actually did exist. Again, this seems to be a typical name, named Betulia. There's a guy, he's an Ammonite, and he becomes, actually converts to Judaism, and his name is Achior. It means brother of light, and so on, so on. Almost all the names in this book have some kind of allegorical significance. This is what I'm saying. This cannot be read as literal history. There is one theory, and there are some versions of this story. This is our oldest version we have in the Greek text, in the Septuagint. But there are some Hebrew versions of the story that are not quite as old, but seem to come from a different tradition. And in the Hebrew versions of Judith, this is all set during the time of the Maccabees. And instead of King Nebuchadnezzar of the Assyrians, it's King Antiochus Epiphanes. And Holofernes is one of his generals, which makes sense. He has a Greek name anyway. And so, and instead of Betulia, this all happens in Jerusalem. And so a lot of scholars about 100 years ago began to think, well, actually, this is a historical narrative. It actually happened not in this place called Betulia, it happened in Jerusalem, and it happened during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, and then when the story was retold in the version that gets in the Septuagint, all of this was changed to this to make it more typical, make it more allegorical. And I think that's probably a good possibility myself. In any case, all this isn't so important. What's really important is the story itself, and it's a wonderful story. So, Holofernes, he is holding the village of Betulia under siege. He wants to know what the best way to get through this mountain pass to attack Jerusalem is. And until Betulia will let him through the pass and show him the best way to get to Jerusalem, he's going to hold them under siege. Judith, again, skipping a lot of stuff, but Judith, she defects to the camp of the Assyrians. Now, this is all a ruse, but Holofernes doesn't know that. She comes there and she tells him, I know that God is about to hand over all of the Jews into your hand, because I am a prophetess. The Spirit of the Lord is with me, and He's telling me that any day now He's going to hand them over to you, because they've begun to eat the food. Again, you have food here. They've begun to eat the food that is reserved for the priests. They've begun to eat the tithes that are set aside from the produce, because they're getting hungry because of the siege. So God is about to abandon them because they're eating the tithes and their offerings. So just wait a few days, and every morning I will go out of the camp to pray and to take my ritual bath, and I will come back and tell you what God says. And Holofernes, he thinks this is a good idea. He is immediately smitten with Judith. He is hoping that he will get her to share his bed. That is his whole intention with Judith. She is a beautiful widow, so she is available, and he would like for her to be his own. Now, when she comes into the camp with her servant girl, she comes there with a basket full of food. And this is something that's kind of funny too, because this whole thing with the basket, she puts together, it's actually an impressive list of food. There's a lot of food, and there are lots of variety, and lots of things that they're not exactly luxury items, but things that the Jews enjoyed eating, things that you wouldn't eat necessarily every day. So things like cakes of raisins and figs and dates and stuff like this. And the list is actually very similar to a list of food that is given in the book of 1 Samuel. Abigail, she prepares a food offering for David to kind of hold him off when he's coming down to destroy her husband Nabal and all of his men, because they have not allowed David and his men to eat with them during the shearing of the sheep. So you get the idea, well, Judith might be putting all this food together to give to Holofernes as a food offering. Not the case. I think the author wants you to think that. But instead, she gets to the camp, and Holofernes invites her to eat with him, and she refuses to eat with him. She says, if I eat with the Assyrians, if I eat your food, if I become one of you, remember, food is a way of building covenant bonds. And so to keep yourself separate, you do not share the same table with them. So she says, if I do this, the Lord will not tell me, when he has abandoned them. So it's in your best interest that I not eat with you. So Holofernes, he concedes that this makes sense. And so she eats the food that she's brought, all this rich food that she has prepared. This is actually for her and for her maidservant. And so every morning she goes out to pray, to bathe herself. Every night she takes this food basket and she eats her own food. And all of the guards of the camp are accustomed to see her go out every morning. She goes out for her ritual bath. They're accustomed to seeing her take out her food basket every morning. She brings her food with her. So they think, oh, this is just normal. They don't realize that Judith is actually about to really trick them severely in a way that they could never expect. Finally, so if you look at Judith 10:5, you have this list of all of her food. She gave her maid a bottle of wine and a flask of oil, and filled a bag with parched grain and a cake of dried fruit and fine bread, and she wrapped up all her vessels and gave them to her to carry. So these are the weapons of Judith, is this food. This is all that she takes into the camp of the enemy. Finally, one day, she tells Holofernes that the Lord has told her that it is time to attack, and so she can eat with him that night. And so Holofernes, he's very excited. He thinks that he is going to wine her, dine her, and get her in bed. This is his whole plan, and he is very excited about this evening with Judith, and she just leads him on. She is flirting with him, and she says she'll be delighted to have dinner with him that night. And then the text is very careful to tell us that she ate nothing of their food. Even though she says, I will become one of the Assyrians, she still manages somehow not to eat. But she does pour one glass of wine after another to Holofernes and gets the poor dope drunk. At one point in the night, finally, Holofernes, he thinks that he can finally seduce Judith, and so he shoos everyone out of his tent so he can be alone with her. And so continuing to flirt with him, again, getting him more and more drunk. And then finally, before Holofernes can carry out his intentions with Judith, he passes out. He is stone drunk. And this is when we get to the next part. He is on his bed, laid out on his bed, passed out drunk. Judith 13, verse 6. She went up to the post at the end of the bed above Holofernes' head, and took down his sword that hung there. She came close to his bed, and took hold of the hair of his head, and said, "Give me strength this day, O Lord God of Israel." And she struck his neck twice with all her might, and severed it from his body. Then she went out, and look at this, verse 9. What does she do with the head of Holofernes? This is so funny to me. After all of this stuff about food, and she won't eat the food of Holofernes, she has her own food bag, and this food bag that everyone's used to seeing her carry around, without, they know that's where she keeps her food. What does she do with the head of Holofernes? She went out and gave Holofernes' head to her maid. Verse 10, she placed it in her food bag. So Holofernes' head winds up in the food bag of Judith, and so she sneaks out of camp with it. And the next morning, she's going out of camp with her food bag and with her with her handmaiden. The guards think nothing of it. They've seen this happen for a whole week, and that's what happens every morning. So Judith goes out of the camp and goes straight back up to Bethulia and gives the head to the elders of the city, and they hang it on the gate, and all of the Assyrians are smitten with terror, and they basically, the Israelites are able to make quick work of them without their general. At the end of the book, in Judith 13, verse 18, we have, again, a beautiful, beautiful text. This text actually used to be in the liturgy, in the pre-Tridentan Rite, on some of the feasts of Mary, we would hear this song of Uzziah, the priest. Starting at verse 18, Uzziah said to her, "O daughter, you are blessed by the Most High God above all women on earth." There you have that line again. Blessed are you among all women. "And blessed be the Lord God who created the heavens and the earth, who has guided you to strike the head of the leader of our enemies." There you have it again. You are blessed by the Most High God, who has guided you to strike the head of the leader of our enemies. And then, verse 19, "Your hope will never depart from the hearts of men, as they remember the power of God." Now Judith then becomes another type of Mary. And this is my main point with all of this module. You have these literary patterns actually establish this kind of cadence that attunes our ear to hear not just about women doing this in the Old Testament, but when you see this pattern and then these same words that are used to praise them are applied to the Blessed Virgin Mary, we realize they are types of Mary. And it invites us to think about this. How is it that these women who do these terrible things, these horrific works of war, how is it that they can be a type of Mary? And I think verse 18 in Uzziah's blessing, "The Lord who guided you to strike the head of the leader of our enemies," is a pretty good hint. Let's look at Luke 1 real fast. This is where Luke, he actually quotes both the song of Deborah and the praise of Uzziah when he has Elizabeth greet Mary. When Elizabeth goes to meet Mary, this is what she says. Luke 1:42, "She exclaimed with a loud cry, 'Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb.'" That line, "Blessed are you among women," that is exactly what Deborah says about Yael, and it's very similar to what Uzziah said about Judith. Not only this, when Mary responds to Elizabeth and she sings her hymn, the Magnificat, she actually says something else that evokes the prayer or the blessing of Uzziah. She says in verse 48, "Behold, henceforth all generations will call me blessed. And that is essentially what Isaiah says will be the case of Judith. He says, "Your hope will never depart from the hearts of men, as they remember the power of God. All generations will call me blessed." Mary is saying to Elizabeth, essentially, yes, I am the antitype of Yael and Judith, whom you have blessed. You blessed me by attaching the blessing that was given to them. You've attached that to me, and I'm claiming that. Yes, among all generations, I will be blessed. I will. For all generations will call me blessed, just like Isaiah said of Judith. So she claims this role as being the antitype of these warrior women. So what does this mean? And I think there are several things that it means. The most important thing is that Mary, she is the arch enemy of Satan. It is through Mary that Satan is defeated. Jesus is actually, obviously, he is the one who rescues us from Satan. But Jesus does that through the intercession of Mary, who stands between us and God the Father and says, yes, I will receive your Son, the eternal Word, into my womb. When she does that, she makes herself the arch enemy of Satan. And being the new Eve without sin, there is utter and total enmity. Just as there's supposed to be enmity between woman and the serpent in the promise in Genesis 3:15, so we see there is utter and total enmity between Mary and Satan, because Mary is without sin. She's not compromised like we are in our war with Satan. She doesn't have any interest in the side of the enemy. And so she's his arch enemy. And by saying yes to the Holy Spirit, saying that may it be done unto me according to thy word, by doing that, she, through Jesus, who is in her womb then, she crushes the head of the snake. Like Yael smashing the head of Sisera, like Judith decapitating the head of Holofernes. Mary goes right to the very head of all of our woes, our compromise and sin, and she stamps it into the ground, and so she defeats Satan. So this is how Mary is the antitype of these real violent women. I think this is important for us to remember, because we have this picture of Mary as being meek and mild, and she is that. She is very feminine, but she is also bold and courageous, and she is the warrior of God standing against Satan. She is the terror of Satan and all of his demons. No doubt about it. The other thing about these women, how do they defeat the enemies of Israel? By preparing a banquet, by using food. And I would also say that this is a type of how Mary, in the salvific economy of God, she also plays this role by welcoming the eternal Word into her womb and giving him a body. Jesus' humanity, all of his earthly body, his incarnation is due to the body of Mary. So she gives our Lord his flesh, and thus prepares actually the banquet of the Eucharist for all of us. And the Eucharist is our ultimate victory over Satan and all of his wiles against us. We have many, many helps in the battle, but our greatest weapon is the Mass.